Welcome back to the courtroom. I'm Terry Darrell Caldwell. We have established that white is an incoherent category, a status granted and revoked by social consensus, political pressure, and even diplomatic convenience. We saw Nazi Germany declare the Japanese honorary Aryans, not because of science, but because of a treaty. Today, we turn to the other side of the ledger, the box that has been contested, policed, and weaponized perhaps more than any other: black. The prosecution would demonstrate that the definition of black is circular, that it relies on a discredited one-drop rule inherited from Jim Crow, and that it is enforced by ideological gatekeepers who can revoke blackness for wrongthink. If white is a political coalition, black is a political loyalty test. Let us begin. The Office of Management and Budget defines black or African American as follows: a person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa. Black racial groups. This is a circular definition. It defines black by black racial groups. It offers no criteria for determining who belongs to those groups. It assumes the very thing it claims to define. The Census Bureau does not ask for proof of ancestry. It does not require a DNA test. It does not verify lineage. It simply asks you to self-identify. Self-identification is fine for personal identity. But when the government uses that self-identification to allocate resources, draw districts, and enforce laws, circular definitions are not acceptable. Imagine if the government defined low income as persons belonging to low income households. That would be laughed out of any policy debate. Yet, we accept the same logical failure for race. So how does the government actually determine who is black? In practice, the United States has relied on the one-drop rule, a legal principle dating back to the 18th century and codified in Jim Crow statutes. The one-drop rule states that any person with any traceable African ancestry is black. The rule was never based on biology. It was based on the desire to maximize the enslaved population. Partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the womb. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, regardless of the father's status. After the Civil War, the one-drop rule persisted in state laws defining who could marry whom, who could attend which schools, who could sit where on a bus. It was not science, it was social control. Today, the one-drop rule has no formal legal force, but it survives in the racial imagination. Consider a person who is 1/16 African and 15/16 European is still perceived as black if they identify as black. A person with the same ancestry who identifies as white may be accepted as white. The same ancestry, two different classifications, the only variable is performance. The prosecution does not argue that individuals should not identify as black. The prosecution argues that a government that cannot define a category without invoking a discredited slave law has no business using that category. Before we go further, let us recall the Nazi example from episode 2. The Nuremberg laws define who was Jewish based on ancestry. If a person had 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, they were Jewish. If they had 1 or 2, they were mixed raced. The Nazis used blood quantum to classify, to exclude, to murder. The one-drop rule is a different formula, but the same logic. Ancestry determines destiny. The prosecution is not comparing Jim Crow to the Holocaust in scale. We are comparing them in structure. Both systems use pseudoscientific ancestry rules to sort human beings into categories with legal consequences. Both systems claimed biological legitimacy. Both systems were frauds. If the Nazi racial laws are universally condemned as pseudoscience, why do we still use the one-drop rule, even informally, in the United States? The answer is inertia. The categories persist because we have not bothered to abolish them. Now, we arrive at the most politically sensitive part of the prosecution's case. The definition of Black is not only circular and historically tainted, it is also enforced by ideological gatekeepers who claim the authority to include or exclude. Consider the phenomenon of no true Black gatekeeping. A Black person who opposes affirmative action is accused of internalized racism. A Black person who votes for a Republican is called a sellout. A Black person who questions the utility of race data is dismissed as a token. A Black person who marries outside the race is said to be abandoning the community. The prosecution is not defending any particular political position. The prosecution is observing a pattern. Blackness is contingent on agreement with certain political and social orthodoxies. Disagree, and you risk being told you are not really Black. This is not a fringe phenomenon. It appears in public discourse, in academic literature, in social media. The phrase, not Black enough, is used to police everything from musical tastes to foreign policy opinions. Now compare this to whiteness. Can a white person be told they are not really white for disagreeing with a white gatekeeper? Occasionally, yes. Think of the term race traitor, but the phenomenon is far less pervasive. Whiteness is generally treated as a fixed status, not an ongoing test. Why the asymmetry? Because Blackness in America has been politicized as an identity that requires correct consciousness. Whiteness, by contrast, is often treated as the default, the unmarked category that does not require performance. The prosecution does not blame any individual for this asymmetry. The prosecution blames the classification system itself. When the state forces people into racial boxes, it empowers gatekeepers to define the boundaries. And gatekeepers, whether on the left or right, will use that power to enforce conformity. The one-drop rule also creates a crisis for multiracial individuals. In the 2000 census, for the first time, respondents were allowed to select more than one race. Approximately 2.4% of the population did so. By 2020, that number had risen to 10.2%, over 33 million people. Why the increase? Partly because multiracial identity has become more socially acceptable. Partly because the Mark 1 or more format allowed people to reject the one-drop rule. But here is the problem. The government still needs to assign multiracial people to single categories for many purposes: voting rights enforcement, health disparities tracking, civil rights compliance. So the Census Bureau uses a bridging algorithm that allocates multiracial respondents to single categories based on statistical probabilities. Your identity, in other words, is computed. The prosecution is not attacking the people who identify as multiracial. The prosecution is attacking a system that forces every citizen into a box, then uses algorithms to resolve the people who don't fit. If the government cannot count you without a statistical model, the government should not be counting you at all. Now, the prosecution asks the jury to consider a simple question. If the government cannot define Black without a circular definition, without invoking a discredited slave law, without empowering ideological gatekeepers to revoke identity, and without resorting to statistical algorithms for multiracial people, then on what authority does the government ask any citizen to check that box? The answer is the same as for white. No authority, only habit, only inertia, only the convenience of bureaucrats who do not want to redesign the forms. The prosecution does not deny that racism exists. Racism is real, but the state's response to racism should not be to codify the very categories that racists created and used. This is like fighting a fire by pouring gasoline on it and calling it a controlled burn. In our next episode, we will examine a category that was rejected for decades and only recently added. What is MENA? We will explore why the government forced Middle Eastern and North African people to check white against their will, and what that tells us about the arbitrariness of the entire system. But for today, the prosecution rests on count 3. The definition of black is circular, rooted in the one-drop rule, policed by ideological gatekeepers, and incapable of handling multiracial identity without statistical models. If the second largest racial category in the United States cannot be defined with scientific or logical coherence, then the entire classification system collapses. And that collapse is not a tragedy. It is an opportunity. Court will reconvene for episode 4. What is MENA?